Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition here of Point of View. This first hour, we're going to look at a couple of issues in the news, some of which maybe you've heard about, others which I suspect you have not. And then in the next hour, we'll be talking about the global church in the age of a pandemic. Janice Rosser Allen will be with us briefly to talk about that. And then we'll get into some other issues in the news. And then in the 2 o'clock hour, we'll have actually in studio Tom Doyle. He's been with us before as we've talked about his book, Killing Christians. And his wife, JoAnn Doyle, will be with us as well. They both have written a book about women who risk and what it's like to actually live in a Muslim country, especially for some of these women that are almost like what they call secret agents for Jesus. So we'll get into that conversation in a few hours. But have posted a couple of articles, and the first one, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I have said more than once, it is not only time to put the kids back in school, it's time to bring the troops home. And I don't mean from Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm talking about the fact we actually have more troops right now in Washington, D.C. And if somebody can show us that there is some really great threat, then okay. But the editors, interestingly enough, of National Review put it this way: don't make the U.S. Capitol a fort. Because we're now starting to hear that not only will the troops be there for months. I mean, some justification was, well, after the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, we need to maybe keep them around for the impeachment trial, which is next week. First of all, do we have any evidence at all that there's going to be any kind of protest in the impeachment trial? But okay. I'm willing to listen, but all of the fences are up there, and now they're talking about trying to create a perimeter fence that will be permanent. Now, I love what they say, that if you have a specific event sometime where you need extra security, where maybe even think you need perimeter fencing, couldn't that simply be added for some of those events when threats are high? But we are now starting to see the Capitol of the United States looking like an armed camp. And apart just from the optics of that looking very bad, it also, I think, is being deliberately done by some of the Democratic leaders to send a signal that we're in charge and nobody's going to challenge us. Well, and of course, the fact that they are listing as one of the great threats right now an individual that I think you probably haven't even heard about, well, maybe some of you in Georgia have, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, that she represents such a threat. Who, by the way, the other day, Senator Ben Sasse said if there's ever been a person that fits the moniker cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, she fits into that category. And even last night, Tucker Carlson took it on and said, look, this is a woman who's a freshman congressman who is really needing maybe to just go and try to do something else. I'll talk about her later. But, I mean, if she's the threat, oh, my goodness. We don't need this many National Guard troops. And if you think that Chewbacca Man was a great threat, okay, maybe we need a few. But we don't need the kind of armed camp that exists right now in front of the Capitol. And so the way the editors put it, you can read it for its entirety. For many years, the U.S. Capitol and the Capitol Hill neighborhood has been among one of the most impressive and and accessible features in Washington, D.C. No longer. Since the riot, January 6th, National Guard and other security forces have surrounded this formerly acceptable seat of government as well as much of the area around it. On January 28th, Capitol Police actually recommend that at least some of these security measures become permanent. This is where I think it's time for the American people to say, okay, this has gone a little too far. This recommendation, interesting enough, has drawn some objections from area politicians, but nevertheless, it gets us back to showing this symbol of free people's self-representation looking more like a fort and less like a capital. They said we need to complete the reviews already underway of the day's security failures, and they talk about some of those and some of the decisions made, I think flawed decisions by the Capitol Hill Police, some of the decisions influenced by the D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and all the rest. But the bottom line is, let's recognize that punishing those individuals responsible for January 6th is appropriate. We will see whether or not this so-called impeachment trial next week, which does not fit the constitutional requirement for a true impeachment trial, will actually surface anything. A little bit later, we might even get into one of the articles I've posted on which there's growing evidence. Matter of fact, pretty much established evidence now that the Capitol assault was pre-planned and had very little to do with a speech given by the president, but was used as an excuse to actually launch that. But nevertheless, it is an illustration, I think, of what certainly needs to take place. And if you haven't figured it out by now, with Donald Trump gone, the decision by some of the leaders in the Democrat Party, especially in Congress, is to find some other people to go after. And the obvious one is an individual that a while back, a variety of individuals, whether it was Andrew McCarthy or David French or a number of others, said that when Marjorie Taylor Greene was able to win the primary in a district that is overwhelmingly Republican, then she would actually be in Congress. And many of them said Kevin McCarthy made a big mistake by not saying we don't really want her in our party, because once you get somebody that's a crazy person in your party, then they can be used to actually try, if you want, to represent that everybody in your party is just like that. And if that hasn't occurred to Kevin McCarthy, look at the number of times the various conservative talk show hosts have taken some bizarre thing that's said by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar and use that to say that's what all the Democrats are like, which is not fair to the other Democrats. But I think, again, when you have a person with really bizarre kinds of ideas, this is an individual that drinks deeply from the QAnon movement, argued that some of these things that we've seen were stage events like Sandy Hook and the shooting at Stoneman Douglas and those kinds of things. It's time to say this individual certainly shouldn't necessarily be part of this party. And there is a real ultimatum right now that the Democrats are using, saying either you remove her from the committee assignments or we'll bring the issue to the floor. And that, I think, goes back to a decision that should have been made months ago when it was becoming more and more obvious that this individual was going to make her way into Congress. The Republicans don't have to embrace her, don't even have to have her part of the caucus, but nevertheless, that is the case. But, of course, once she's gone, if she is, they're going to pick somebody else because there is a real need right now to have an enemy. And when Donald Trump is not there, then the enemy, of course, we're seeing all sorts of various editorials now about Christian nationalism. I'm pretty sure they're going to pick out another member of Congress to go after and all the rest because they need sort of a common enemy. And sooner or later, it's maybe going to be you and me, as we talked about yesterday in terms of trying to define people as domestic terrorists. Whether that word terrorist even applies really is irrelevant, because if you can call an attack an insurrection, if you can call people you disagree with insurrectionist and terrorist, then that justifies all sorts of actions that can be taken. When we come back from the break, though, just for a minute, I do want to talk about these vaccines. We are having difficulty producing them. We're having difficulty distributing them. And you know what? I have a few suggestions on how to improve that dramatically. So let's come back and we'll talk about that briefly right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about a commentary by Glenn Greenwald criticizing the call for a domestic war on terror. One of his concerns is the attempt to justify new domestic police powers because speech can incite violence. Not only is that used to justify going after fellow Americans, it was also the basis for the impeachment article against Trump. Citing Rudy Giuliani in what constitutes incitement won't be helpful since he has been the former president's lawyer. It's worth mentioning that the former lawyer was at the January 6th rally and convinced that most of those were thinking about getting in out of the cold than heading to the Capitol. But Glenn Greenwald is an appropriate commentator since he has not been a Trump supporter and has been a critic of the war on terrorism. He says much of the alarmism and fear-mongering is being driven by a deliberate distortion of what it means for speech and to incite violence. He also adds the phrase inciting violence was also what drove some of the worst war on terror abuses. The Supreme Court has set a high bar for incitement. Otherwise, any passionate speech or inflammatory rhetoric could be cited as the cause of a riot or insurrection. The justices ruled in Claiborne versus NAACP that the state could not hold NAACP leaders liable on the grounds that their fiery speeches urged a boycott that later incited their followers to burn down stores. The court relied on a previous ruling in Brandenburg versus Ohio that overturned a criminal conviction against a KKK leader who publicly advocated the possibility of violence against politicians. You know, the flawed arguments of incitement shouldn't be used to impeach and remove a president who has already left office. They also should not be used to incite a domestic war on terror. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about this vaccine problem for just a minute. Now, I recognize some of you may not want to get the vaccine, and that is understandable, but there are a lot of people that would like to get it. And in order to get the vaccine, ultimately, we can get over this pandemic, many people believe, and that, I think, is a reasonable assumption. But there are some real problems that are illustrated by the production and distribution of these vaccines. So I thought I might even introduce kind of a new segment we might do here on Point of View. And it's based upon something that happens every once in a while when I go out and speak. After I finish speaking, sometimes people are so enthusiastic about what they've heard, they come up with enthusiasm and maybe a lack of common sense and say, you know, Kerby, you need to run for president. And I always say, no, I'm not running for president. There's not a chance that I could win a primary or anything like that, and I'm not interested. But for a minute, I thought maybe the segment could be, what would I do in the area of vaccines if for just one day I were president of the United States? And I'm going to take that on for just a minute, because the issue is, first of all, that we are not vaccinating the vulnerable. I mean, wherever you think about the vaccines, there are quite a number of individuals right now that are high-risk individuals that are not getting the needle in their arm. And you can look at the numbers for just a minute and recognize that it would probably be better if we could have an honest president or an honest head of CDC or something to simply say, look, here are the numbers. It's not going to work. But, of course, after you've already had candidate Joe Biden, now President Joe Biden, saying, I'm not going to shut down the country, I'm going to shut down this virus, let's look at the numbers. Might even get something to write with, because you'll see exactly why we have this problem. We have 52 million Americans above the age of 65. And about 202 million between 18 and 65. So let's just first of all say, can we focus on, for just a few minutes, people over the age of 65, and then people in that next category who might have some kind of comorbidity, which would put them at risk if they did not get the vaccine. You with me on that? Okay, so how many vaccines have been administered? Well, this is a problem, because we just yesterday talked about the fact that we can't even keep track of 20 million vaccines. Somewhere are in the pipeline or somewhere sitting in warehouses. We honestly don't know, which is pathetic, but okay, there we are. At least we can honestly say that there have been 32 million doses that have been administered. But again, right now we're talking about Pfizer and Moderna, and that means that most of those individuals that have the first shot are waiting for the second shot. We got about 6 million that have had both shots. Okay, that's great. 24 million or more that need the second dose of that 32 million. And so you still have just a lot of individuals that are either elderly, that is over the age of 65, which it would be me, as a matter of fact, or individuals who are at high risk. And you could put that number at, maybe some people are estimating, again, these are funny numbers, but, CDC and the federal government, that's the best we can come up with, 113 million people. Okay, 113 million people. Write that one down if you want. Right now, we're administering 1.3 million doses every day, which is much better than Trump was doing under 940,000 a day. So it's increased some. And first of all, credit to Trump before, the Trump administration. They weren't quite at 1 million, but they were getting closer. And now we have over 1 million. But again, you can do the math. 1.3 million doses per day. And then you have to get at least one shot in 113 million Americans. That's going to take you, if you do it every single day, and we're talking about holidays and weekends and everything, till April 29th, or basically to the end of April. Are you with me now? Okay, so this is the difficulty that we have. And this is based upon the fact that we're able to produce enough of those vaccines actually to then have enough distribution channels so that they eventually make their way into the arms of the vulnerable. You with me? Okay, so how can we produce more? There is what I would consider to be a logjam, and I'll give credit in this case to some of the writings also from National Review, in which they were saying maybe there's something else we could do. And I might say this. If I were president, I would say we can't do anything about the Pfizer vaccine because the Pfizer vaccine was developed with Pfizer money. Now, I would still hold out, because if you listen to the interview we did with Dr. Steve Weinberg, yes, Pfizer didn't get any government money, but we also promised to buy all of the vaccines from them. So in some respects, indirectly, they got money. But the one I want to focus on is the other vaccine by Moderna. Moderna did get government money, and so I would argue as the President of the United States that we own the rights to the Moderna vaccine. You say, well, so what? Well, it turns out Moderna is not a very big pharmaceutical company. Having grown up in a family where my father worked for Pfizer, my grandfather was a doctor, I'll tell you that the largest pharmaceutical company is Johnson & Johnson, which have their own vaccine, which isn't as effective as you'd like it to be. Number two is Pfizer. And then you go down to Roche and Merck and a variety of others. And so what I would do is say, look, we have Moderna's drug sales of like $187 million. Roche's $48 billion. That'll give you an idea of how much more is there. And so I would then simply say, look, we would take that license of the Moderna vaccine, which is being produced right now by kind of the pygmy among the giants of the pharmaceutical industry, and recognize that by giving that particular license to produce the Moderna vaccine to Roche or Merck, you could be producing thousands of times more vaccines for viruses every single day. Many people think that it could be at least 200 times as much. Some people think 1,000 or more times as much. And so if I were president, I would say, you know what? We own the license to the Moderna vaccine. Thank you, Moderna. We're going to let you keep producing it as fast as you possibly can and making all the money that you deserve for the fact that you actually developed that. But we're also going to take that license and put it in the hands of one, maybe even two, because I'm going to be greedy now. I might even have Merck, because I think Merck's now no longer even working on their vaccine. So Merck's interested, and maybe Roche, and maybe some others that you could go down the list and say, you all have the opportunity now to produce those too, and the licensing will still give a benefit partially to Moderna, but then you get a financial benefit from that as well. So that's what I would do as president. Again, you can decide whether you would elect me or reelect me or not. But the point I'm making is that kind of thinking, to his credit, was something that really was good for a person like Donald Trump. He had been in the business world for a long time, and he simply says, wait a minute, if we've got a logjam over here in business, well, let's move one over here. Let's even have these companies, if we need, compete with each other to produce the vaccines, and to do this in a way that enhances the financial benefits to the free market. However, if you've been either a senator, a vice president, and now president for 47 years, and you always think that government is the answer to all of your problems, this particular kind of suggestion probably will not have occurred to you. But I would suggest to you that if we are concerned about producing more vaccines, the simplest and fastest way to do that is to allow other pharmaceutical companies that have the production capabilities to gain the license. End of my presidential speech for the day, but I think sometimes people say, well, what would you do? Well, that's what I would do, and I think it makes a great deal of sense. And then, of course, you have to solve the other distribution problem. I'd also bring in Federal Express and say, how in the world did we lose track of 20 million doses of vaccines since we supposedly have chips on all of the containers? Can you help us out in trying to figure out how to find those so that this never happens again? And these are the kind of, if you will, cooperation between the private sector and the public sector that I think are going to enhance health and eventually help us get over the pandemic. Anyway, enough for my talking on that particular issue, because there are so many other issues we need to talk about, and so we will do that. But first, you might want to go and find some of the articles we've posted. The first one, don't make the Capitol a fort. When we come back, we're going to talk about Senate Democrats and this whole idea of the 14th Amendment, and a few other articles that we have posted for you to read today before, of course, we get into some of the other conversation we'll have in about a half an hour. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We talked about kind of turning the Capitol into a fort. We've talked about what to do with some of these vaccinations. But let me get to my second article that I think you would appreciate. It has to do, as Jonathan Turley says, that the Senate is playing a dangerous game with the 14th Amendment. Now, to understand this, and I won't try to get into all the deep weeds from a legal point of view, we are talking about the fact that this time next week, we will have a so-called, and I have to call it a so-called impeachment trial, because as I look at my Constitution here, the trial that is supposed to be held in the Senate has to be convened after a serious consideration in the House, and that is what many people have referred to as a snap impeachment. There was no opportunity to present contrary witnesses or to do really any investigation whatsoever. Number two, a trial requires the Chief Justice of the United States, that would be John Roberts, to convene it and to oversee it, and he will not be doing that. So you can see that there are lots of difficulties. And of course, when there was a test vote, if you will, last week by Senator Rand Paul, it was very obvious that you could get very few Republicans to go along with the Democrats. And so if you need 67 votes in the Senate, you simply do not have them. So this is why some people have talked about maybe we can come up with something like censure. And a lot of this relates to my commentary today on incitement. And I would have to say that my commentary today on incitement takes a lot of information from Glenn Greenwald. It is amazing when I find myself more and more quoting from an individual who identifies himself as a liberal, but nevertheless is honest with the facts, and is an individual that not only is a journalist, but has a legal background. Well, likewise, now our second article is actually something written by Jonathan Turley, who again identifies himself as a liberal, hardly a fan of Donald Trump, anything but is the professor of law at George Washington University, and has said that this whole attempt to try to deal with an individual that is no longer in office, Donald Trump, does not make sense in terms of impeachment, might make sense in terms of censure, but don't take the dangerous step of trying to tie it in some way to the 14th Amendment. And so he actually goes on to say that after a vote suggesting about half of the Senate has constitutional prudential concerns over the trial of former President Trump, members are discussing censure as an alternative. He says, now, I previously supported a censure resolution, but this is a censure with a twist. He says Senator Tim Kaine, I remember he was the vice presidential candidate with Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, would add yet another controversy to an array of constitutional issues by electorally barring Trump under the 14th Amendment. Because what they really want to do is not actually censure the president or former president. As a matter of fact, if you want to understand how insignificant censure is, Andrew Jackson, was censured by the United States Senate. Pull out a $20 bill. Notice who's on there. Now, pretty soon, I think we're going to have somebody else on there as well, here at Tubman or somebody like that. But nevertheless, I mean, it just shows you that censure doesn't mean a lot. And so they're trying to figure out a way to do a censure so that it would prevent Donald Trump from running for office again. And they're trying to tie this to the 14th Amendment, which I think gets back to this issue of incitement and insurrection, some of which is in my commentary today, which you can read. Some of it's in this second article. Let me go on. Jonathan Turley, again, a liberal law professor, but one that's honest with the facts in the Constitution, says, look, censure is not mentioned in the Constitution because it's simply a resolution with the view of Congress. Such a statement could allow for bipartisan condemnation, and I think certainly if a censure vote were put forward today, you would only, I believe, need a majority, and I'm pretty sure you could get that majority without any difficulty whatsoever. And so that's the kind of the idea. But then he says, for the first time ever, the House used a snap impeachment and sent the Senate no record to support its article. As before, the Senate can refuse to call witnesses and vote on the record or lack thereof, meaning a brief trial, and about half the Senate rejecting the case. It has led some members back to censure as the effective substitute for conviction. He says part of the controversy of the snap impeachment, I like the fact he calls it that because that's really what it was, is using a trial solely for electoral disbarment. The Constitution refers to the trial as to decide on whether to remove the president, he puts in quotes, and so that leads some of us to doubt any retroactive trial, while disbarment is an optional punishment for after removal. But that assumes, and I'm putting my words in here, that you've removed him from office when he's already been removed from office. There's the problem. So anyway, he says retroactive trials remain a closed issue, even for most scholars who have reached conclusions on either side. Now, he says, Senator Tim Kaine and others suggest the Senate can avoid the need for a trial but achieve the same result by a majority vote on censure. At issue is the 14th Amendment section that bars people from holding office if they have engaged in insurrection or rebellion or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. That's part of the 14th Amendment, which I think was not intended to be addressing issues of impeachment or removal from office. Matter of fact, in some respects, I'd like to go back and look at the legislative history of why that was included in the first place. But let's go on. He said this has never been, the 14th Amendment has never been used to disqualify a former president. It's not clear that Congress has authority to bar a citizen from office by majority vote. So this article goes on and tries to explain that in some way. And I think it just illustrates, again, some of the frustration on the part of those who are the Democratic leaders, both in the House and the Senate, who want to do something to harm Donald Trump, but find themselves kind of coming face to face with some of the constitutional limits that are there, and also just the practical limits of the fact that you're just not going to get 67 of the 100 senators to vote for impeachment when you have no real trial that is actually taking place and no previous even investigation for the one article of impeachment. So it has so debased the term impeachment as to make it almost insignificant, and that's a sad commentary as well, and just illustrates what has happened to the way in which we used to revere things like the Constitution and some of the remedies therein. Just before I take a break, though, I thought it was interesting because now we are starting to see, for the first time, at least some of the press, I'm not going to overplay this, but some of the press starting to show at least casual interest in the Biden family business. Now, you remember that as we got close to the election, the New York Post actually had a blockbuster article that came out based on the laptop left by Hunter Biden. Now, there wasn't that much that wasn't already known. We've had whole interviews with experts on this program that have talked about how the Biden family over these years have benefited from the fact that Joe Biden has been a senator and then a vice president. Of course, now he's the president. But nevertheless, Gary Bauer puts it this way. When Joe Biden originally declared his candidacy for president, it did at that time touch off a flurry of articles about the Biden family business. You can go back to Politico and find stories, for example, talking about Biden Inc. and the rest. And so more recent events forced them to revisit this subject last week after a Florida law firm ran an ad during the inauguration that highlighted one of its associates. That would be Dr. Frank Biden. Politico reported that during the campaign last year, Joe Biden pulled Frank aside and said, watch yourself, don't get sucked into something that would, first of all, hurt you and presumably more importantly, hurt the chances of Joe Biden getting elected. So in the past, Frank Biden has bragged about how his last name was a tremendous asset, brought him automatic acceptance. Joe's other brother, that would be James Biden, who we've talked about on this program, also has said, we've got people around the world who want to invest in Joe Biden. And, of course, you might ask the obvious question, what are they getting for their investments? Well, amazingly, a reporter actually raised concerns about Frank Biden's business dealings at a White House press conference this last week. And, of course, the concerns by the reporter were dismissed. But I think sometimes when there's just a little bit of fire, a little bit of smoke, after a while things start taking off. And so the media still hasn't shown a great deal of curiosity. But nevertheless, you have all of the videos of interviews with the various associates of Hunter Biden traveling on Air Force Two, having a I think they now estimate billion-dollar business deal with the Communist Chinese and a variety of others. And, of course, the ongoing federal investigation of Hunter Biden's laptop. Now, it is quite possible the sitting president might be able to shut some of that down, but it's starting to show just a little bit, a slight bit of curiosity on the part of the press about some of the dealings in the Biden family. And so I suspected that might surface after the campaign, after the inauguration, and after a month has gone by, and now we're in February, and I think that prediction's coming true. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention at the top of the hour, we're going to talk about the global church in an age of the pandemic. Janice Rosser Allen will be with us. She's with ICM. We'll talk about that ministry and some of the things that were done around the world in the midst of the pandemic and the lockdowns and all sorts of other issues. Then we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. And then in the 2 o'clock hour, we will have Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle in studio talking talking about this new book, Women Who Risk, and I think you will appreciate that conversation as well. But let me come to this issue of incitement. Again, this is going to sound somewhat legal, but it's pretty straightforward. My commentary today talks about just this issue of incitement, which is, of course, exactly at the key and one of the very foundations for this article of impeachment. And I, again, as I mentioned a minute ago, quote from Glenn Greenwald, who is not a fan of Donald Trump. As I point out in my second paragraph there, if you cite Rudy Giuliani, people say, well, of course, he was the president's lawyer, so he doesn't have any credibility. But a person that's not a Trump supporter says, look, when you look at this whole idea of inciting violence, we have some pretty good court precedents that say that we, at least at the Supreme Court level, have put a very high bar on incitement. As I point out, otherwise, any passionate speech, any kind of inflammatory rhetoric could be used and cited as the cause of a riot or an insurrection. So we allow people to say some pretty strident things, but we don't hold them guilty for that because we value speech. And I give you a couple of examples. For example, the Claiborne versus NAACP ruling that went down years ago was being used at the time to actually go after some of these civil rights leaders at the NAACP because they had had some fiery speeches about boycotting some of the businesses that were discriminating against African Americans. And later on, a few of those individuals heard those speeches, wanted to burn down the stores. But again, the Supreme Court said, you can't hold them responsible for calling for a boycott. They didn't call for them to burn down the store. And so that is the case. And that case was based upon one that actually happened the year before. That's the Brandenburg case out of Ohio. And this was a conviction that actually had gone against the leaders of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, who actually in this case had even publicly advocated the possibility of violence against politicians. I use all that to simply say, look, we don't like people that will try to do anything to incite others. But at the same time, we have in this country, because we believe in the First Amendment, placed a pretty high bar on what incitement is. And so that's one of the arguments that is certainly going to be used next Tuesday. But there's another one, and that is that there is a direct connection, they will argue, between a speech given by former President Donald Trump and the subsequent actions. And that gets us to our third article here. Growing evidence Capitol assault was planned weakens the incitement case against Trump. And the first quote comes, again, from an individual that's hardly a Trump supporter. That would be Alan Dershowitz. He's been on this program with us before, a emeritus professor of law from Harvard. And he said, look, if Trump didn't know about it, they planned it without him, then you're missing the causal relationship. It would have happened without his speech as well, so that would be relevant in the issue of causation. And so they really begin to take apart this idea that there is a one-to-one connection between the two. The article goes on to say, look, for the speech or any speech to meet the threshold of incitement, a speaker must first indicate a desire for violence, and second, demonstrate a capability or reasonable indication of capability of carrying out that violence. And that is a definition given by Kevin Brock. He is the former assistant director of intelligence for the FBI. And he says in the case of Donald Trump, neither were there. In his interview last week, he simply said that he listened to the speech by Donald Trump and listened to the entire speech, January 6th speech. He said, I didn't hear a single word about or anything that would trigger a reasonable person to believe that he was inciting violence. He even used the words peaceful and respectful. You may not have liked the speech. You may try to say, well, just simply because he had that speech at the Ellipse made it possible for that to take place, perhaps. But if you want to try to prove that in a court of law, where, again, it may end up being more of a kangaroo court next Tuesday, then I think in most courts, and those that are based upon Supreme Court precedents are simply going to say, You just don't have the requisite needed actions and words for incitement. But nevertheless, just wanted to put some of that out there because there is quite a bit of evidence, and you can read this article. It goes on for pages. I just read you pieces of the first 2 pages just to, again, help you think through what will be unfolding, no doubt, next week. Just before we finish, though, one of the issues surrounding that was the issue of elections. And for those of you that have said, why aren't we actually going to check out some of these various voting machines? My answer is, well, some actually are. Here's one piece. The Maricopa County Board of Supervisors unanimously approved a full forensic audit of the county's election equipment after weeks of wrangling with state legislators. This is a county in Arizona, and it will hire independent firms to conduct 2 separate audits, one beginning today, the other on February 8th, next Monday, of its voting machines and other equipment. The investigators will look at the equipment's hacking vulnerability, verify that no malicious malware was installed, and test that tabulators were not sending or receiving information over the internet. Now, the people that were part of this board of supervisors, the chairman said, look, Maricopa County elections were administered with integrity throughout 2020. That's a fact. Multiple audits to date have proven as much, and multiple court rulings have concurred. But it's also true that a significant number of voters want the additional assurance that a full forensic audit of tabulation equipment might bring, especially given all the misinformation that spread following the November 3rd election. This audit shows our commitment to providing that assurance. We'll see if they find anything, and if they don't, then I think some of the people saying, well, these machines were manipulated need to stop saying it, because you have already had one, if you will, audit. You now today have a second full forensic audit, and then you have a third one next Monday. And these are the kinds of things that I think need to happen, because if indeed people keep spreading various rumors, the quickest way to quash them down is to say, here's the evidence, and here's why that particular rumor is false or true, depending on what we can find out from that investigation. So anyway, some people have said, why don't they do an investigation? Well, at least in Maricopa County in Arizona, that's exactly what they're going to do. As a matter of fact, they started it today, and then they'll do another one next week, and we'll see what the results are. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to get into some other topics. If you'd like to read some of these articles that we've talked about today, Don't Make the Capitol a Fort, the Senate Democrats on the 14th Amendment, the fact that the Capitol assault was pre-planned, and even my viewpoints commentary today on incitement, they are all available at the website pointofview.net. Let me also mention, I do from time to time talk about the fact that if you click on the viewpoints commentary, you're free to print it out, but there's also a little button there that says never miss a viewpoint. Sign up here. So if you would like to receive the viewpoint commentaries that I write, they will arrive in your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexters will arrive on Saturday. They're free of charge. We're glad to give them to you, and it's a resource that we wanted to put in your hands to give you some of the facts, figures, and other information that you need to know about. Let's take a break. When we talk about the global church and the pandemic, that will be our topic at the top of the hour, and we'll be right back.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and this is an opportunity for us to look at a couple of things happening around the world. This first half hour, we're going to be talking with Janice Rosser Allen about ICM, and that is an organization started back in 1986 by her father, and she has been the ICM board member and then more recently the executive chair as well as the CEO and president of that. And we'll get more into that in just a minute. And then we're going to spend some time an hour from now in studio. We'll have Tom Doyle, who's been with us many times, and now Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle will be with us. New book, Women Who Risk, Secret Agents for Jesus in the Muslim World. You might remember some of the other conversations we had with Tom Doyle, Killing Christians as one of his books, and many others, so we'll get into that conversation. In between those two interviews, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. I've posted a couple of articles that you may want to find, including one that relates very much to this conversation: what global churches did when their government said they couldn't have large gatherings. And that tells the story a little bit of ICM. And to further educate us about that, Janice Rosser Allen is with us. She is the CEO and president. She also co-authored a book with Ellen Vaughn, God in the Crossroads, Signs of Hope. And so, Janice, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure. Thank you.
A lot of people are probably saying, ICM, what does that stand for, and what is that organization? Matter of fact, in some of the press materials, people said maybe it's one of the best-kept secrets, and if nothing else, you have been so involved in really establishing churches around the world, and with tremendous success. But give us a little bit of a background before we get into some of the things that have unfolded this last year because of the pandemic.
Well, thank you so much for letting me share a little bit about what God's done through ICM. ICM stands for International Cooperating Ministries, and we feel that God has called us to come alongside existing indigenous ministries and help develop the church in whatever way will benefit them and resource them. As you already said, the ministry was started by my father at the ripe old age of 65, and he had been a real estate developer in his career, and I think began to use the things he had learned in business about applying those for advancing the kingdom globally, and how we could distribute the gospel and enrich the ministries with resources that they wouldn't otherwise have available. So back in the 80s, we really started focusing on a couple of things in particular, and that is providing a translated curriculum of the entire Bible that teaches the entire Bible, and then also helping to provide the resources that local congregations need to build their own churches. So as we sit here today, we've had a presence in 100 countries, and at the end of 2020, we reached and exceeded our goal to build 10,000 churches around the world.
Just
Pretty amazing what God's done.
And again, back to that indigenous part, because you've pointed out, let's just use one statistic, that there are over 600,000 villages in South Asia alone. And you've said, we can't send enough missionaries. We have to equip the local church. And you have been so successful all these years in establishing these churches. And again, there are some great opportunities. There are Bible studies in the local language. They're distributed also in audio. So this is an organization people need to know more about. And if you go to our website, we have a link to your website, or they can just go to icm.org and then learn a lot more about that. Yes. Also dealing with, why the church and how churches can change communities, the impact and the success and all the rest. But I thought as well, we might want to talk about the article that I've posted, and this comes from our friends at Christian Post, in which it was entitled, What Global Churches Did When the Government Said They Couldn't Have Large Gatherings, because we recognize that in this country, that meant we didn't go to the church building. The church didn't cease to be the church, but the church buildings were a problem, and social distancing and those kinds of things were a challenge. Well, if they're a challenge in this country, they are almost devastating in some of the other countries where you've been working. So kind of finish the story there, because it's an important one that I think people need to know about.
Well, I tell you, Kerby, you have described so well the concern that we had, of course, back in, February and March. At that point in time, ICM, through our partnerships, had over 900 churches were under construction. And, all the work, all the heavy lifting is being done by the indigenous people. They are their churches. And I fully predicted that we were going to see a slowdown and construction all over the world because we were all experiencing lockdown. But to my amazement, our partners would figure out how to get teams to the sites and keep the numbers of people working at the construction site below what the government allowed. So they figured out ways to keep the construction moving along. And for me, that just, reinforced the value and the importance it is to these people in villages to have a place to worship. But, the other thing which I think really was exciting to watch was how these different congregations began to lean into the ability to have the church building open 24 hours a day. So if they could only have 10 people gathered at a time, they would have that happen all day long into the night. And always, valued coming to a place. And I think the perspective, is that their alternative for sheltering in place was often a mud hut or, very difficult circumstances. So being able to go to the church and worship meant a great deal to them. But the other thing which we clearly began seeing was how the congregations were reaching out into the communities and helping to alleviate the starvation that was going on in many locations because people could not work. There wasn't any work for them to do. And in these cultures where they work for the money they need that day to eat that day.
Yeah, day laborers, yes.
Yeah, they didn't have an option. So the churches were the ones taking food into the villages and the homes. So anyway, it was just very, very inspiring to me to see the transition and the importance of the church during this very difficult time.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about a couple other issues because, first of all, if you get this article on the 5th page, you can actually see them constructing one of those church sites. But another thing I know you were involved with is what is called these Hope Centers, and I wanted to focus on that as well. And if this is the first time you've heard about ICM, which it is likely to be the case, you can go to our website and find out a little bit more. Also find this article that appeared in Christian Post, and we'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about a commentary by Glenn Greenwald criticizing the call for a domestic war on terror. One of his concerns is the attempt to justify new domestic police powers because speech can incite violence. Not only is that used to justify going after fellow Americans, it was also the basis for the impeachment article against Trump. Citing Rudy Giuliani in what constitutes incitement won't be helpful since he has been the former president's lawyer. It's worth mentioning that the former lawyer was at the January 6th rally and convinced that most of those were thinking about getting in out of the cold than heading to the Capitol. But Glenn Greenwald is an appropriate commentator since he has not been a Trump supporter and has been a critic of the war on terrorism. He says much of the alarmism and fear-mongering is being driven by a deliberate distortion of what it means for speech and to incite violence. He also adds the phrase inciting violence was also what drove some of the worst war on terror abuses. The Supreme Court has set a high bar for incitement. Otherwise, any passionate speech or inflammatory rhetoric could be cited as the cause of a riot or insurrection. The justices ruled in Claiborne versus NAACP that the state could not hold NAACP leaders liable on the grounds that their fiery speeches urged a boycott that later incited their followers to burn down stores. The court relied on a previous ruling in Brandenburg versus Ohio that overturned a criminal conviction against a KKK leader who publicly advocated the possibility of violence against politicians. You know, the flawed arguments of incitement shouldn't be used to impeach and remove a president who has already left office. They also should not be used to incite a domestic war on terror. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Janice Allen with us as we are talking about ICM, and if you would like to know a little bit more, on our website we have a link where you can go to icm.org, and that is an organization we wanted you to know about. And Janice, one of the things we've talked about with other guests on this program that have had mission organizations or church planting organizations is how different the experience was. For us in this country, it has been inconvenient, of course sometimes devastating if you lost a loved one, but it has been completely devastating and even beyond for a day laborer, as you pointed out just a minute ago. If you are dependent upon working that day to earn enough to buy food for that day, you can see very quickly that the pandemic and the lockdowns have been so devastating, and there has been such a need for missionaries, indigenous people, local churches, and other outreaches to even minister and keep people alive in the midst of all that we've faced around the world.
That's exactly right. You know, although we know in so many ways God is always going to redeem, every difficulty. And as we have seen, the church really being so instrumental in some of the nations where we work, it's been incredible to hear the testimonies of how many people are coming to faith in the midst of this. One of the things that we've all experienced is needing to shift to other ways to do Bible study or to connect with people, and that is very true in nations all over the world. And one of the ways that ICM distributes our Bible study materials is digitally. And we have just seen an absolute explosion in the number of people accessing our content for online Bible studies and using social media. We launched a social media site in Arabic in the spring as the pandemic was we were really full speed ahead. And already we have like 30,000 people on that. People in their homes are, where possible, finding community in ways that they hadn't imagined before. And it's opening up an opportunity for the gospel that may never have existed otherwise. It's pretty exciting.
I would say so. One of the other things that you've developed at ICM about 10 years ago were these hope centers. And again, if you think that it is difficult for a breadwinner in the family to support his or her family when there is no work to be done, just imagine what it's like for an orphan or an at-risk child. And so that's been another very significant aspect of your ministry, hasn't it?
Well, it really has. In response to what we were seeing, our partners, the ministries that we partner with, we're already doing extraordinary ministry with children. And I think, being a mother and a grandmother myself and my background in nursing, I have a great love for children and just making sure that they are cared for. The least of these are cared for. And so as I would travel with our partners, we began to see these churches were caring for the kids, oftentimes giving them their only meal of the day. And they were doing so under the worst of circumstances. They would try and squeeze them into the little church building or sit them out in the dirt surrounding the church and trying to feed them out there. And so we decided that we would begin working with our partners to build these hope centers, which operate under the umbrella of the local church. That's always the way ICM works. Because that's where the accountability is, and that's where the ministry happens on the ground. And these hope centers will include a kitchen to cook some food. It'll include some classroom and some kind of toilet facilities. And it has just warmed my heart to see these children being cared for in a loving way, kids who face just horrible situations in their home life, or they just live on the streets, and they are able to come to these hope centers and be cared for.
Let's, if we can, talk about how people can help you. There's a way in which people can actually be involved monthly to equip an indigenous pastor, and there are all sorts of things through prayer and financial support that are available, and that's one of the reasons why we encourage people to go to our website, pointofview.net, or go directly to yours, icm.org. But how can our listeners help you as you are really trying to develop this global church ministry around the world?
Well, I would say the most important thing is to be praying for ICM. We're just seeing globally heightened persecution. We're seeing globally the natural disasters that are happening. We're seeing turmoil and shifts of government and so many things that are making it very difficult for our brothers and sisters around the world. So praying for them. The other way, Kerby, is like you were saying, financial help. For about $50 a month. People can help provide the Bible study resources to folks in their own language. It's intended for oral learners because it's a audio or video format, and that will provide lay people with Bible study materials that they may otherwise never have access. We train pastors with that same material all over the world. And that is an extraordinary gift to these pastors who can't afford to leave their village and go to seminary somewhere. So giving them access to Bible material that they can use to help shepherd their congregations is a wonderful way to get involved.
Well, again, we have this article that appeared in Christian Post that talks about the global churches and what they did in terms of actually learning to weather the storm in the pandemic. But eventually, I hope we'll come out of some of the lockdown and some of the restrictions that we've had right now. So that is the first article we have there. But again, if people wanted to know more about this organization, maybe bring that information to their missions pastor or get involved with you individually, they can go to icm.org. And maybe when we come out of lockdown, is there a possibility that some people can go with you to some of those countries where these churches are being built and see firsthand exactly what God is doing?
Absolutely. I can't wait for that time to happen again. What we often will work with individuals that really feel God has called them to help equip the church globally. For a gift or a pledge of $1,000, you can be assigned to a specific church. And there are ways to travel with us and see what God's doing. See how God is moving in his world today, and it's such a blessing to be able to do so. But we have projects, construction projects available in over 90 countries that people can get involved with and help support those as well. So many ways to get involved.
Well, again, we appreciate you, Janice, telling us a little bit more about what's been happening. We've posted a good article for people to read more about this, and, of course, also a link to your website. So thank you for joining us today here at Point of View.
Well, thank you so very much for letting me share some about ICM.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some issues in the news. But at the top of the hour, as I mentioned, we're going to have Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle with us as we talk about their new book, Women Who Risk. But just before we do that, I might get into a couple of issues. First of all, you'll notice my commentary today is about this issue of incitement, and that is going to be key because a week from today, we will have a so-called impeachment trial. I call it so-called because, first of all, it was a snap impeachment, as some people have pointed out, and did not even actually go through the requisite kind of production and conversation and defense that is usually part of the impeachment that has taken place in the past. Second of all, it will be conducted next week, not by the Chief Justice of the United States, which is required by the Constitution, but instead by another individual. So there's some real questions about that, which leads to one of the articles about whether or not there will actually be a censure document rather than an impeachment document. So we'll talk about some of that. But my piece on incitement really helps us understand what at least the legal definition is, and that comes from Glenn Greenwald, who is an individual that is hardly a Trump supporter, and also the third article we have here talking about the growing evidence that the assault on the Capitol was planned. And another individual, hardly a Trump supporter, Alan Dershowitz, says you don't have a cause and effect, and that's another real big issue. So we'll come back and talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend about a half an hour looking at some of the issues in the news and really kind of getting ready for what might happen next week with the impeachment trial. And that is why this, first of all, Viewpoints commentary is on the subject of incitement. I quote from Glenn Greenwald, and we've talked about him before, as an individual that has a law degree but is a journalist, and I really appreciate the fact that he's honest with the facts. In many cases, you would have to say, look, he's not necessarily a Trump fan, but he's just kind of appalled by some of the things that have happened, the unwillingness to honestly and fairly talk about, for example, the New York Post article on the Hunter Biden laptop, the unwillingness to really begin to evaluate what has been taking place in terms of social media censorship, and this particular piece, which you can read as well, on the fact that if you're going to use this argument of incitement, there is a very clear legal precedent and, if you will, threshold for that as well. And I use him because, as I point out in my second paragraph, citing, say, like Rudy Giuliani, well, people say he's just the president's lawyer, so of course he's going to say that. But Glenn Greenwald is not exactly inclined to do that. But he says, first of all, he's concerned by much of the alarmism and fear-mongering that has been used to say that a speech incited violence, and then goes and reminds us of some Supreme Court precedents that exist. Probably the two best that I quote in one of the paragraphs is a ruling that came down from the Supreme Court, Claiborne versus NAACP. And if you're not familiar with that, that is where the state was trying to hold some of these civil rights leaders responsible for some of the fiery speeches where they were calling for a boycott of some of these establishments that were discriminating against African Americans. And the point I'm making is that you have a really high bar that has been established by the Supreme Court for incitement, because otherwise any kind of passionate speech or inflammatory rhetoric could be justified. And they ruled that they could not be held responsible for the fact that some of their followers wanted to burn down stores. And that was based on a previous ruling that went the other direction, because that was where there had been a criminal conviction against a leader of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, who had even publicly advocated the possibility of violence against politicians. And again, these are the reason why, first of all, if you're going to use incitement, that needs to have a very clear legal definition. But it also relates to one of the articles I've posted, which is the growing evidence that the Capitol assault was planned, and as a result, that weakens the incitement case against former President Donald Trump. But again, we're not quoting from individuals that would be pro-Trump. As a matter of fact, the opening quote comes from Alan Dershowitz. He's been on the program with us before. Again, hardly a Trump supporter, emeritus professor of Harvard Law School, in which he said, look, if Donald Trump didn't know about this planning that took place before, that they had planned it without him, then you're missing what he calls the causal relationship, the cause and effect. It would have happened without his speech as well, so that would be relevant to the issue of causation. And he goes on to point out some other things as well. But a little bit later in the article, there's a very, I think, helpful quote from Kevin Brock. You might say, okay, who is he? Former Assistant Director of Intelligence for the FBI. And he said, really, for a speech to meet the threshold of incitement, a speaker must, first, indicate a desire for violence, and second, demonstrate a capability or a reasonable indication of capability to carry out the violence. And that is something that he says simply does not exist. As a matter of fact, he said, I went and listened to the entire speech by the president, former president, and he said, I didn't hear a single word about or anything that would trigger a reasonable person to believe that he was inciting violence, even use words like peaceful and respectful. And so in some respects, if you're really looking for an attempt to impeach, remove the president, it's kind of hard to talk about removing a president that's no longer in office. And this is why one of the other articles I've posted really talks about the move in Congress right now, and we'll see where it goes, to maybe move away from the idea of impeachment to the idea of censure. And this is a piece written by Jonathan Turley. Again, I've got to appreciate somebody who is, by his own definition, a liberal, a person that's hardly a fan of Donald Trump, who is a professor of law for George Washington University, but nevertheless has on a number of occasions kind of spoken out to his fellow liberals saying, wait a minute, you're going down the wrong road here. This is not going to work. And he points out that after a vote suggesting about half of the Senate has constitution or prudential concerns over a trial of former President Trump, many members, this would be in the Senate, are discussing censure as an alternative. Now, Jonathan Turley goes on to say, now, I previously supported a censure resolution, but that is censure with a twist. But he goes on to say that Senator Tim Kaine, you might remember him, a senator from Virginia, was the running mate with Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, would add yet another controversy to an array of constitutional issues by electorally barring Trump under the 14th Amendment. If you read through this particular piece, you can see he's got some real questions as to whether or not the 14th Amendment is relevant to any of this at all. But he says, first of all, censure is not mentioned in the Constitution because it's a resolution with the view of Congress. Such a statement could allow for bipartisan condemnation. I think you probably could get a good number of individuals besides just Democrats voting for that as well. But he says for the first time ever, the House used what he calls a snap impeachment and sent the Senate no record to support its article. That's because there was no due process. We've talked about this before. And as before, the Senate can refuse to call witnesses and vote on the record or lack thereof, meaning a brief trial, and about half of the Senate rejecting the case. So the argument being made right now by Senator Kaine is that a censure resolution could make two findings, that there was an insurrection and that the president gave aid and comfort to the insurrectionist. Now, why would they want to say it that way? Well, it turns out, if you go back and pull out your Constitution here, you'll see that the 14th Amendment does bar people from holding office if they have engaged in insurrection or rebellion or given aid and comfort to the enemies thereof. It's pretty obvious from the things that Senator Kaine and others are saying, they're not so much wanting to remove Donald Trump from office with impeachment because he's not in office. What they want to do is try to bar him from ever running again. If they simply use the censure argument, how effective would that be? My favorite line is that Andrew Jackson was censured by the Senate. Pull out a $20 bill. Look who's on the $20 bill. Now, he may not be there much longer, but nevertheless, just an illustration that sometimes censure doesn't mean a great deal. And in this particular case, Senator Tim Kaine wants to make it a much bigger deal and use that, if he can, to actually bar the former President Donald Trump from ever running for office once again. I think it's wrong-headed and going in the wrong direction, but that's one of the reasons why we posted that article for you to read and maybe even post and start a conversation with some of your friends. But just before we take a break, let me real quickly talk about the first article I've posted here, and it's entitled, Don't Make the U.S. Capitol a Fort. There's been a real concern about the fact that once we had, the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, we have now seen just an enormous number of National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. And first of all, the optics of that are horrible. We have all these troops around the Capitol. We have these fences. And now there is an attempt to maybe even have perimeter fencing that will be permanent. At that point, there are a lot of people that are starting to say, wait a minute, we need to think through this a little bit. And the editors of the National Review put it this way: don't make the U.S. Capitol a fort. For many years, the U.S. Capitol and Capitol Hill neighborhood had been among the most impressive and accessible features of the Washington, D.C. area. No longer, since the riot on January 6th, National Guard and other security forces have surrounded this formerly accessible seat of government, as well as much of the area around it, and now their recommendations to make these security measures permanent. My argument would simply be, let's recognize that if there is a high-profile event or there's a time in which threats might be high, you could certainly put up more security or include a perimeter fencing. But the argument is been made that, well, we need the troops there because of the impeachment trial, which, of course, is next week. And I guarantee you, in light of all the statements I'm seeing right now, those troops will still be there. And as I said before, it's time to bring the troops home. Not the troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, because actually we have more troops some days in Washington, D.C. And if nothing else, as they say, it's time to stop making the U.S. Capitol look like a fort. This is the people's house, and the threats are not anywhere near justified by the troop deployment that we have taking place right now. We'll take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention, I didn't talk about this earlier because we had Janice Allen on, but we've had 2 FBI agents that were killed today, 3 others injured in really one of the deadliest shootings in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This took place down in Florida, if you haven't seen that, and maybe we'll have more about that tomorrow, but I didn't want to ignore that. I certainly meant to bring it up earlier, but didn't want to interrupt some of the conversation we had with her in terms of the global church. But we certainly encourage you to pray for the families of those who have lost their lives, the others that have been wounded, and we'll get into some of the conversation about that probably tomorrow. But just before we wind down this hour, next hour we're going to be talking with our friends Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle about the new book, Women Who Risk, and maybe even talk about some of the previous books that they have written as well. I thought it might be good for just a minute to talk about about the vaccines. And again, I recognize not everybody wants to take a vaccine, but there are a lot of people that do. But the problem that has surfaced is that we're not producing vaccines fast enough. Number two, even when we do, we are losing track of some of them. I pointed out yesterday we've lost track of 20 million of these doses of vaccines, and that's a real concern. And then number three, the distribution when we have them. And as I've said before, every once in a while when I go out and speak, at the end, people sometimes are very enthusiastic and they say, you know, you ought to run for president. Okay, they've lost their common sense because I'm not running for president. But I thought I might initiate a new feature here occasionally on Point of View. What would I do if I were president for a day? And I think there are some solutions here that maybe haven't occurred to the current president, Joe Biden, might have occurred to the previous president, Donald Trump. But stay with me. I'm just going to for a minute say, what does a president and what could a president do to change the reality? And first, the reality is that if we continue at this state, it's going to take a long time before even the most vulnerable people will get a vaccine. If you want to write some of these down to follow me, we have roughly about 52 million Americans who are age 65 and older. And then we have about another 200 million that are anywhere from ages 18 to 65. And if you look at some of those individuals, about 45% of them, the best estimates are, they have some comorbidity. So, first of all, you've got a fairly significant number of people that you need to vaccinate just in the vulnerable group. You with me on that? Okay, how many have we administered so far? Well, again, let's hope we have the right numbers, because we can't. When you've lost 20 million vaccines, oh boy, we're in trouble. But the United States at least estimates that we have administered about 32, almost 33 million doses so far. But of those, about 6 million have had number 1 and 2, the first and second dose. So you still have about 24 to 26 million that need a second dose. But that still leaves 113 million who are elderly or in a high-risk category. Okay, so there's 113 million. Okay, we right now are administering about 1.3 million doses per day. If you do the numbers, that means that even if you are going to continue at that level, in order to at least get one shot in the arms of 113 million Americans, it's going to take you another at least, 86 days, something like that. And that's April 29th, or the end of April, essentially. So obviously and of course that's assuming that we keep up the pace we have right now. We also do vaccinations on the weekends and holidays and all the rest. And so you can see that this idea of coming out of any kind of moratorium, any kind of a lockdown, it's going to be in the future. Part of the problem is production. And here's where the difficulty lies. Pfizer is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in America. Matter of fact, second largest. Johnson & Johnson, number 1. Moderna is so far down on the list, and that's the problem. It's a really small one. As one person put out the other day, it's kind of a pygmy among giants. But here's the issue. What would I do if I were president? I would simply say, look, Pfizer developed this with their own money, but then, of course, they also got government guaranteeing that they were going to buy the doses. But Moderna took the money, and so I would say we as Americans then own, in a sense, that vaccine patent. And so as a result, since we own it, let's say Moderna, you can keep producing in your facility, but you are going to only be producing so many a day. We need to pass this on to some other pharmaceutical companies. So let's take the time to sell the rights or give the rights to, let's pick a couple down the list, like Roche or Merck or something like that, because these are much larger companies, and as a result, we can scale up rather dramatically the amount of vaccine that we might be able to produce. Merck basically gave up their attempt to actually develop a vaccine, as recorded in this particular article in National Review, and so it certainly could have a much greater capacity. Some people believe it could produce 200 times as much as as Moderna because of its drug production capacity. And so that would be the case. If you gave it to Merck and Roche, I mean, you could really begin to crank out these vaccines very quickly. Now, again, you could do that in such a way that says, look, Moderna, we don't want you to lose out. We want you to keep producing the vaccine. You are the ones that came up with it. You deserve all the credit for having, in record time, figuring out how to develop this mRNA vaccine. But let's see if we could also license it to Merck and Roche and some of the others. And then as a result, we would be able to get more vaccines produced. So there's the first solution that I think a president who thinks more like, say, Donald Trump, who's been in the business world, says, what can we do to get some of these other free enterprise, really, if you will, private entities to get involved in production? You know, kind of a public-private coalition that will create more of the vaccines necessary. Number two, then you might then say, because we have more vaccines, we need to really put the onus on the various state and local communities to step up their distribution and find some other very creative ways to get those into the arms of individuals. And then, you know, I think I might also pull in, I don't know, something like FedEx or UPS and say, can you help us figure out how the next time we won't lose 20 million vaccines? We don't seem to know where these are right now. We supposedly have a chip on every one of the containers, but somehow even the Centers for Disease Control can't seem to figure out where all those are. Not that I'm running for president, not that necessarily these are all the best solutions, but if indeed we are trying to get vaccines into the most vulnerable people in order to save their lives, doesn't it make sense to try to figure out a way to deal with this bottleneck, which is a very significant bottleneck, if you haven't noticed, in terms of producing the vaccines? And then the other bottleneck of dealing with the distribution. Those are some things that I think would make a great deal of sense. Not sure that these would necessarily have occurred to the current president because he spent, 47 years as a senator or vice president, now president, in always seeing government as the answer. But I think I have some solutions, and they're the kind of solutions that somebody like Donald Trump would come up with. A public-private venture where if you got a bottleneck in terms of the production of a vaccine, well, then let's let them continue to produce the vaccine, but let's find some others that we can enlist in producing those vaccines as well so that we can get over the hump and no longer find ourselves dealing with this vaccine problem and with this pandemic problem that has really crippled this country for just about a year or so. Anyway, that's my suggestion if I were president for one day. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, JoAnn Doyle, Tom Doyle will be with us, and we'll be talking about women who risk. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about what God is doing in the Muslim world. I think you're going to find this to be so encouraging, but also a great challenge as well, because we begin to ask the question that Tom Doyle asked: could you retain your faith if it meant losing your life or your family's life? And that comes from a book where we talked with him in the past about killing Christians, and that is just one of many of the great books that have come from this family. And we also not only have Tom Doyle with us, and I might give him a formal introduction, president and founder of Uncharted Ministries, a graduate of Biola College, Dallas Theological Seminary, licensed guide in the state of Israel, to mention just a few, author of so many books. Matter of fact, this and many other books by Tom Doyle I recommend whenever I speak on Islam. So, Tom, it's always great to have you in studio.
Great to be here, Kerby. Thank you. We go back a long way, and I'm thankful for it.
JoAnn, I am thankful for you and your dedication to share this, but I'm also thrilled that you have brought your wife with you today, JoAnn Doyle, and I've seen her before teaching as well in different church settings, a pastor's wife and an individual that has incredible stories. This is a book that you both have done, Tom and JoAnn Doyle. It is Women Who Risk: Secret Agents for Jesus in the Muslim World. Just came out in late January, and it is a book that you might want to get a copy of, and we're going to be talking about that as well. So, JoAnn, thank you for being with us as well.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. I'm excited to be here.
I'm glad to have you both here, but and again, in some of the past situations, Tom, we've been talking about books that both of you wrote, but this will be the first time you're doing an interview together, right?
That's it. That's right. Yes. Yeah. And first official book together. JoAnn was always helping writing, but this time we just knew, we got to do this together. Some of the women's stories are truly just mind-blowing, really.
Yes. And one of the things I appreciate about your books, and I have recommended many of those, but I'll just hold this one up since people should be familiar with this, is that you've been willing to tell us some stories that have come, in some cases, from refugee camps or in other circumstances where these are individuals that stood for their faith in the midst of unbelievable persecution. We recognize that when you look at the top 10 countries where there is persecution of Christians, if you take North Korea out, the others are Muslim countries, right. Although India's now made it up in the top 10 too, which is kind of interesting. But most of these are Muslim countries. When you're a Christian and you stand for your faith, boy, there's a real price to pay, isn't there?
Oh my gosh, there is, especially someone that comes from a Muslim background. In fact, we have new terminology now. It's MBBs, Muslim background believers. It's a phenomenon not only in the Middle East but around the world. And Muslims know this, that even if they're in a Muslim country that's not Sharia law, and it's maybe softer than, say, Iran or Syria, they still could get taken out by their own family. They could. Someone just feel the disgrace, they defected from Islam, and they go after them. So their greatest treasure is their greatest fear, actually, their family, when they come to faith in Christ.
And JoAnn, that gets us into something which surfaces all the way through your book. Sadly, a woman has very few rights in a Muslim world, and the father, in some respects, has a disproportionate influence over them. Is that fair?
Absolutely. It's so sad. Women's place in Islam is in the shadows. Mm-hmm. They are behind. They have less worth even than their male children, which is shocking, isn't it? And so they're used to being ignored and forgotten. And we want to show them in Jesus that they are not forgotten. Not only does Jesus see them, but so do his followers.
One of the things you talk about here is that when these individuals become Christians, they actually just take off. I mean, the power of Jesus Christ in their lives is amazing. But you mentioned something in passing, Tom, that we might get back to, this idea that the father or the family could take them out. You've taught and been at Dallas Seminary, so have I. And I know a number of years ago, one of the individuals that we had at Dallas Seminary was a Muslim woman who had converted to Christianity. And before she came to the seminary, she was being chased all over the United States and Canada by her brother, who wanted to kill her in what is called an honor killing. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and so that would be a family trying to just erase the shame that has come to their family because they're a Muslim family and they have someone that has left Islam, become a believer, sharing the gospel with their Muslim family. And so they would, instead of trying to talk to them, let's just get rid of them. And that happens. And Kerby, you hear this all the time. People say, is persecution coming to America? And I always say this, it's already here.
Yes.
For former Muslims that live here, just because they left Saudi Arabia doesn't mean the family stopped looking for them. Like you said with this woman, they were chasing her in America. It's happening. And there are cases of women being killed here in the United States in honor killings.
Let me just mention, if you'd like to join the conversation or add your own stories, feel free a little bit later, because you can give us a call. That's 1-800-351-1212. JoAnn, let's see if we can kind of get into some of this. And boy, it's just, there's some powerful stories. An individual being slapped across the face by a father because you're going to marry this individual and all the rest. But let's start with the beginning, because that was one of the most powerful ones, the story of Nori. Can you tell us Nori's story?
This is one of my most favorite stories. Oh my gosh. So Nori is a nurse, and she is from a Muslim family, pretty fanatical. Her father is an imam, and Nori has a big problem. She is demonized.
Yes.
And every night, the jinns, as they call them in Islam or in the Middle East, the jinns come and bother her. And she's throwing dishes and yelling at her mother and father, and they do not know what to do. But Nori, as this nurse, is so compassionate during the day. But one day, this doctor, who is also a Muslim, notices that Nori is just not herself. And so he asks her, what's wrong? And she finally has the courage to confide in him and say, the jinns are bothering me and I don't know what to do. This Muslim doctor says, you know what you need to do, Nori, is you need to go see a Christian pastor. And she said, what do you mean a Christian pastor? We're Muslim. And so, sure enough, she starts on a journey because no one in Islam is able to help her. And she finally goes not to one, not to two, but 3 churches before someone can finally give her answers. The church she happens to go to is some of our national leaders. The first thing they do is lead Nori to faith in Christ and then deliver her of those demons. And then Nori goes home, and when her mother finds out what happens, that she's given her life to Christ, she shamed the family. So now the mother starts, beating Nori, and the persecution starts toward her. I won't feed you. I'm not going to help you with anything. You are on your own. So every night, Nori goes into her bedroom after getting beaten by her mother, and she decides, I'm going to start a Facebook page, because I bet there's people out there that have questions just like I did. She gave herself a false name, Huda Has Hope, and she began answering questions to people. What do you want to know about Jesus? She was just one step ahead of them. And it turns out that one day, as she's sharing with people with Huda Has Hope, she notices her mother's name come across the screen.
Wow.
And then she begins this online relationship with her mother not knowing that it's her daughter in the next room who's answering those questions.
We need to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about, but at one point she says, I know Christians are infidels, and my father would probably kill me for going and asking for spiritual advice. So again, it's just, even as she was considering this, it was a very significant, if you will, step of faith, obviously a Muslim step of faith. But we'll come back and talk about this, because these stories are ones that probably give you chills. But if nothing else, this is why I think you really enjoy the book. It's just out, and we have all sorts of information about it. Of course, you can contact their ministry, unchartedministries.com. We also have a place for you to order it if you'd like, both in paperback and Kindle. Look for it in your local bookstore if you can, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about a commentary by Glenn Greenwald criticizing the call for a domestic war on terror. One of his concerns is the attempt to justify new domestic police powers because speech can incite violence. Not only is that used to justify going after fellow Americans, it was also the basis for the impeachment article against Trump. Citing Rudy Giuliani in what constitutes incitement won't be helpful since he has been the former president's lawyer. It's worth mentioning that the former lawyer was at the January 6 rally and convinced that most of those were thinking about getting in out of the cold than heading to the Capitol. But Glenn Greenwald is an appropriate commentator since he has not been a Trump supporter and has been a critic of the war on terrorism. He says much of the alarmism and fear-mongering is being driven by a deliberate distortion of what it means for speech and to incite violence. He also adds the phrase inciting violence was also what drove some of the worst war on terror abuses. The Supreme Court has set a high bar for incitement. Otherwise, any passionate speech or inflammatory rhetoric could be cited as the cause of a riot or insurrection. The justices ruled in Claiborne versus NAACP that the state could not hold NAACP leaders liable on the grounds that their fiery speeches urged a boycott that later incited their followers to burn down stores. The court relied on a previous ruling in Brandenburg versus Ohio that overturned a criminal conviction against a KKK leader who publicly advocated the possibility of violence against politicians. You know, the flawed arguments of incitement shouldn't be used to impeach and remove a president who has already left office. They also should not be used to incite a domestic war on terror. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you would like to go to our website, pointofview.net, or you can go to unchartedministries.com. Those would be some resources. The book is entitled Women Who Risk. We have Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle with us, and we've been talking about some of these secret agents for Jesus in the Muslim world. We did leave a little bit of a cliffhanger, and that's always a good thing when we go to one of those mandatory breaks, because you were talking about Nori, who is communicating unknowingly, and the mother unknowingly communicating on Facebook. But there's a little bit more of that story, isn't there?
There sure is. And oh my goodness. So Nori has started this Facebook page called Huda Has Hope. And when she sees her mother's name come across the screen, her first thought was, oh my gosh, praise the Lord. And she wanted to run out and tell her mom, it's me, Mom, I'm Huda. But the Holy Spirit said, no, stick to the gospel. So she didn't. She did not go out there and tell her mom. She kept answering her questions. And over time, like several weeks, every once in a while, her mom would come online and she would be able to answer some of her questions. But one day, one of the questions that came through just shattered Nori's heart. It said, I want so much, her mother said, I want so much what my daughter has, but I am so afraid. And that's a picture right there of what life is like for women behind the veil. And so, again, Nori knew she needed to stick to the gospel. So she answered that question, responded to her in love. And then every day she would go to work. Then she would take her lunch break, go to her discipleship meeting, go back to work, come home in the evening and go back in her room and work on Huda Has Hope. Another day comes by. Her mother jumps online again and she starts answering more questions about Jesus. And do you know that Nori had the privilege of leading her mother to faith in Christ over Facebook, and her mother not knowing that they're in the same apartment in 2 different rooms. And again, the Holy Spirit is saying, not now. So she still did not tell her mother that she was Huda. So a couple more weeks go by, and where Nori goes to church at the underground church, they're having a baptism. And so Nori is so excited, she's going to get baptized. And finally, the Holy Spirit says, now. So she goes out and she tells her mom, Mom, it's me. I'm Huda. I'm Huda Has Hope. And her mother just cried and embraced her and said, Nori, I am so sorry for the way I treated you. I am so sorry for all the abuse I called you. And I love Jesus and I love you. And then Nori said, well, I'm going to go get baptized. Mom, would you come? Would you watch me get baptized? And her mother said, absolutely, it will be my greatest joy. So the next day they go, and Nori is baptized, and there's her mother sitting in the front row crying tears of joy as she watches her daughter give that testimony, that beautiful testimony that she's going to live for Christ. So after Nori is baptized, she looks at her mom, and they're hugging and embracing, and her mom says, next time, Nori, I want to get baptized. Well, standing behind them, of course, is the pastor. And you know pastors, they
hear those things.
They don't want waste any time. And the pastor says, well, what's stopping you? Let's do it now. Let's baptize you right now. So sure enough, they march back up to that water, and Nori's mom is gloriously baptized the same day as her daughter is. And Nori is still doing that Huda Has Hope, which, by the way, has gone viral. She has thousands of followers.
Yes.
Isn't that an exciting story?
That is such a, well, and again, if you were to write that as a Hollywood script, Tom, I got a feeling people would say, yeah, we can't greenlight that. There's no way. That wouldn't ever be true, and that's exactly what happened. Every one of these stories is that way, isn't it?
It really is. And when I heard that story from the pastor, that one of our national leaders that led her to faith in Christ, I said, this is a movie. He said, it does kind of feel like a movie. It was so many twists and turns, but you think about the animosity toward each other. They both come to faith. They're both baptized.
The same
on
day.
The same day.
Yes.
It really is remarkable. Only God.
Mm-hmm.
Such a great story. And it kind of gets us back to something you've written about before, and that is, since we don't have resident missionaries there, it is sometimes the dreams and visions or social media that are very significant in the salvation of many of the Muslims in the Muslim world.
It's really true. We have a new initiative called I Am Second. We used to be with I Am Second, but we have I Found the Truth. And it's former Muslims sharing their stories. And that's the thing. Every one of us has a story. Nobody can take that away. And when they come on for 5-6 minutes and just talk about how they met Jesus, it's powerful. And they're online and people are resonating with them. And it's really an amazing thing. So the internet, God's using that. Dreams, visions. Sometimes people pray for Muslims and they're healed. Those kind of things. It's like rocket fuel for the gospel, Kerby, really. They are listening then. They're a captive audience if they see a miracle or something profound on the internet where someone's willing to risk and tell their story.
Now, when you talk about Facebook, JoAnn, again, some people might say, I'd like to read that. But again, that's in a different language, isn't it?
Right. It's all in Arabic. I wish it was in English, because wouldn't it be fun to go on there and listen to what Huda Has Hope has to say?
Yes, all the reason for some of us to learn Arabic if we can.
That's right.
They've taken some of the things I've written and put them in Arabic, and I go, I guess that's okay. And we had somebody the other day that was looking at some of it, was across from me, and said, yeah, it looks pretty good. So I was like, I'm afraid that's not a language I'm very good at, but that's a great story. And I want to keep the train moving, because chapter 2 is the worst marriage in Syria, and that's a powerful story. And since we have at least 7 chapters, I'm going to do my best to try to cover most of those. Can you share that one briefly?
Oh my gosh. Actually, Tom probably tells this story better, but yeah, this one just breaks my heart, especially as a woman. So there's Mohammed. And let me tell you, if you met Mohammed, he's not the most handsome guy. So just keep that in mind. But Mohammed is married to the sweet woman, Dina, and Dina is abused, as so many Muslim women are. He beats her mercilessly. But the worst part of their marriage is that she is not his only wife. He has 66 other wives, if you can imagine. How is that even possible, you wonder? Tom, you want to tell them about Muta and how that happens?
Is a temporary marriage. So you can go to imam, and if a woman agrees, you can be married for a day, a month, a year, whatever. Pay the money. It's a contract. It's really legalized prostitution. And so That's what he does. He has 3 businesses. He's rich off each one of them. He's a bad guy when you think of it. He's really a creep, I think. If I'm Jesus in heaven, I'm probably thinking of bypassing this guy, but that's not our Jesus. He starts hitting him with dreams about himself. And who is this Jesus? And he just keeps coming and coming. And Jesus is saying, I love you. I'm here to pay for your sins. I paid for your sins. And so finally, Muhammad is just undone, and he thinks, who do I talk to? I don't know any Christians. He sees a bombed out church one day in the city that he lives in Syria, and there's some Christians in there having a short Bible study and prayer, and he walks into the church and sees a Bible, and he steals it. In typical Muhammad fashion, they would have given it to him. He steals it, goes home and starts reading it, putting it under his mattress every night. He waits till Dina goes to sleep. His life is changing. He finds the underground church and starts going. And he comes back to Dina one day and just says, I want you to know I'm a new person. Jesus saved my life. He forgave me of my sins. And you know what Dina said? Kerby, she says, well, isn't that convenient?
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm supposed to forgive you of your sins. I will never forgive you. I hate you. I would have killed you if I could, but I never had the chance. He knew he had some work to do. And over time, she saw the change. He was going to an underground church for almost a year. And one day on a Sunday morning, she walked in and he just burst into tears. He couldn't believe she's actually interested. And of course, his life had changed. He wasn't hitting her. He would no more women, all of that. He was getting cleaned up and God was doing something. She comes to faith in Christ now. Both their families, they don't live happily ever after, always, Kerby, in the Middle East. Both families wanted to kill him. They had to get out. They went to Lebanon. They worked the refugee camps. She is fearless in those camps.
Wow.
She shares the gospel. What a powerful, powerful story. And they have an incredible love for each other.
I might just mention, too, that in the chapter there's a kind of an interview between you and Muhammad, so that's kind of fun. And then you also have some information about Dina as well. So you can kind of even listen in on the conversation. But again, we have to take one of those mandatory breaks, so let's do that. But as we go to a break, I would encourage you maybe to go to your computer, if you have one, to go to unchartedministries.com. Because first of all, when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit more about all the great resources that are there. Because you have God's Stories, you have a bookstore, a number of other things, how you can support these individuals that have been so involved and faithful in this ministry. So we want to maybe encourage you to go to the website right now. It's unchartedministries.com. Or if you can't remember all that, just simply go to pointofview.net and click on the picture there of Tom and JoAnn. The book is, again, out, and so you would certainly be able to find it in your local bookstore. It's Thomas Nelson, W Publishing, and it is one that I think is going to be really powerful. 7 different chapters. We've talked about 2. We're going to have to pick it up a little bit here in the next section if we can. But just again, these are great stories, and I think would be a real challenge and encouragement to you, and would encourage you to pray for your Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers that maybe are around that need to hear this as well. So this is a book that you can use in a lot of different ways. When we come back, we'll talk about how you can use it right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about women who risk. And Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle with us. It's just a fascinating book. Lots of stories. We may not cover all of those, but just before we get back to another set of stories, Tom, talk about what's available at Uncharted Ministries, because eventually we come out of this whole lockdown. There are opportunity for people to take trips with you. Yeah. There are ways in which people can pray for these Muslim men and women. There's an opportunity for them to support you and learn a lot more. So what is available when they land at unchartedministries.com?
Yeah, where you're going to see a great story on the cover of the big headline there. And we always have a new story that we want that for people to be able to read and be inspired about what God's doing. So you have that. And then you go and we have resources, we have books and videos and things like that. But then as we think globally, act locally, we want to help people get involved in what they can do here and how they can get some training. And then we want to take them to the Middle East. And we do ministry trips in the majority of the Muslim countries. We're not going to go into Iran, not Syria. It's not helpful. Believers get exposed there. But some of the other countries we go, and we'll do a medical clinic or a women's event or sports ministry and get people involved in ministering to Muslims. And you know what they find out? They find out they're human beings.
Yes.
And they have needs and they have wants, and they're not all that different from us. Major difference in our religion, for sure. But when people get around them and see how gracious they are and how welcoming they are, they get a desire to really start sharing the gospel with them.
Yes.
And we train them how to do that.
And again, a lot of people say, well, what do I know about the Bible? Believe me, you know a lot more about the Bible than even the, quote, pastors in some of these countries. You have absorbed so much by osmosis. So it's just a great opportunity. So I really want to encourage people to find your website and to support you both in prayer and financial support because of the great ministry that you have there. Thank you. It is so good. Okay, JoAnn, I got to talk about marry him or your mother dies. How many people on their wedding day got a slap across the face by their father? But that's how you open chapter 3.
I know. Oh my gosh. Yes, Farah. She is, I wish you could see her face. She is a transformed woman. So Farah is a Jordanian woman, and she was more of a moderate Muslim and wanted to choose her own husband. She did not want to have an arranged marriage, which is, of course, very common in Islam.
Yes.
So Farah goes and gets a job. And she works in a bank, but Jordan has a rule. They have a law. If you're a single woman and you have a job, the government keeps back part of your paycheck every month. And they save that for you, though. And when you get married, you get that money. So one day, Farah, after working at that bank for about 7-8 years, gets a phone call from her father. And her father says, your mother's cancer's back, and we don't have money for treatment. So I've arranged for you to marry a man this week. Basically, he says, Farah, marry this man or your mother dies, because we need that money that's been saved for all these years.
Yes.
So that starts this whole thing. And she ends up marrying this man who's much older, and the abuse starts immediately. And Farah now, by the time I met her, several years later, 2 children later, and she is despondent. She's suicidal. She hates her life. And so one day she's out and about, and now by this time the Syrian war has started and the refugees are flooding into her country, which is tragic. But she sees this woman across the way, and she's dressed in rags, but she's beaming. And so Farah has the courage. She walks up to her and says, I'm a Jordanian woman. You're a refugee. Why are you so happy? What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? And this woman beckons her, come here. I have a secret. She said, you have a secret? She said, yes, I found Jesus as my Savior, and he has given me joy. Do you want that joy? And of course, Farah's drawn in, and she begins meeting with this Syrian refugee woman, and Farah finds Jesus as her Savior, and immediately that depression leaves, and Farah is filled with joy. Interestingly enough, her husband sees the change in her. And when he goes to slap her the next time, she all of a sudden has this boldness and she says, stop it. You may not hit me. I am a child of God. I am no longer a Muslim. And so stop it. And you know, that usually doesn't stop it. Usually that just, accelerates the abuse. But the Spirit of God fell over her husband, And he did stop. He backed up, and he has not beaten her since. 3 years later, he is now reading the Bible. He's not yet come to faith in Christ, but he sees the change in his wife, and he wants what she has. And one quick part of the story that I love is the day before Farah was going to get baptized and celebrate the Lord's Supper for the first time, that night before, she had a dream of Jesus, not before she came to Christ. This is after, of course. And in this dream, the room was filled with people all dressed in white and shining, and she knew they were all believers. And she felt such love. But she noticed at the side of the room there was a staircase, and she walked up that staircase, and at the top was Jesus. And now he was brilliant white, shining, and he looked at her. He put a gold crown on her head, and he said, "Farah, you are mine. I love you." And then he put a piece of bread in her mouth and said, "You belong to me." And then she woke up. And of course, the next day, Farah celebrated the Lord's Supper for the first time and was baptized. And when she was baptized, she said, "Man, I did not want that water to come off my body. When I was underneath and all wet," she said, "I felt so clean for the first time in my life, truly clean on the inside." So she said when they offered her a towel after she was baptized, she didn't want it. She put her clothes on her wet body. She didn't pull the water out of her hair. She wanted that to linger. So Farah is your sister in Christ. You'll get to meet her one day in heaven.
Isn't that an incredible story, Tom? And again, these are just stories that if you tried to make them up, people would say, well, they don't make any sense at all. And that's exactly what's happening.
It's so true. And I think when we look at baptism, a lot of believers, well, I want to be baptized, and some flat just don't do it. But these are Muslims that have come to faith in Jesus, and they're being baptized, and they know
that's the price to pay.
That is the line of demarcation. You do
is.
that, there's no returning back. And so, in fact, I met a young man, Muhammad. Obviously, he was Muslim, comes to faith in Christ. I met him in Jordan. Within a month, he's baptized. And I said, "Muhammad, that's awesome. You got baptized right away." And he said, "Well, Jesus said, believe and be baptized." And he said, after all, it's an initiation, not a graduation, Tom. I thought, amen to that,
That's right?
Well, it just, again, there is a price to pay, as you pointed out there, because in some respects you can believe something in your heart, but that's that public affirmation. And for us to take baptism in such a cavalier way when it is so significant in many of these Muslim countries is pretty incredible. I think we need to talk about the liar from Lebanon. Can we fit that one in just before we take another break? I mean, that's another great story.
Oh, gosh, yes. And this is another great story. And this sweet woman, oh, my goodness, she was asked a question one day. And she was asked, "Are you satisfied with your role as a woman in Islam?" And she said, "Everything in me was screaming, no, I hate it. I am treated so poorly." But she said, "With my lips, I said, absolutely. Women are honored in Islam." But after she left the gentleman, who was a follower of Christ, of course, after she left that gentleman, she said, "I pondered those words and realized I am not honored as a woman in Islam." And she had never read the Quran before, but for the first time in her life, she picked it up and started reading the words for herself and realized all that she'd seen lived out in her life, how she'd been treated from the time she was a little girl, was spoken about in the Quran.
It is.
And so she said that for the first time I realized, what am I doing? Why would a woman ever want to be a Muslim if this is what the Quran teaches about how we are valued? And so, I don't know, do you want to continue that story, Tom?
You sat down with her.
Oh, okay. So anyway, all that to say, you know who she meets that tells her about Jesus? She meets Dina, who we talked about earlier. She's the one that, her husband, Muhammad, had the 66 other wives.
Right. Yeah.
And so actually in a refugee camp where she finds herself, Dina comes and she shares the gospel. And together, these women now are followers of Christ, serving Jesus and risking it all for him.
I love how they all connect up. It's like a Charles Dickens novel.
It really
is. But this is all true. I mean, it's not
totally
fictional
true.
or anything of that nature. And again, this was a struggle that she was having because in some respects, that's a question I get sometimes when I speak on Islam. Why is it that women are coming to Islam And first of all, if you're born in a Muslim country, you're supposed to be a Muslim. But also there has been an appeal to some that, well, because they focus on purity and the hijab or whatever, that may be appealing. But then when they get into it, they recognize, as you've shared already on 2 separate occasions, what it's like to be a woman in the Islamic world. And it's very dangerous. And it goes all the way back to the Quran, which says that a woman's value, even their testimony in a court of law, is half of a man's,
That's right.
Yeah, it's so true. And during the Syrian war, ISIS was importing brides from Europe. There were some that came from Minnesota, and they were connecting with these men online, and they were giving them lines about that the food is better here. You're going to marry a hero. This is someone that's well respected. And women were actually getting on planes, going to Turkey, finding their way into Syria, and then, of course, they feel like they just went into a living hell. And it was totally opposite of what they had been, told it was going to be.
We're going to take a break, and we've shared with you, I guess if I'm counting here, at least 4 of the 7 stories. We may pick out one more, but just a great story or 2 that you can find in Women Who Risk. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, we are privileged to have in studio with us just for a few more minutes, Tom Doyle and JoAnn Doyle. And Tom, I guess I'll toss this one to you. First of all, the book is entitled Women Who Risk, and it's Secret Agents for Jesus in the Muslim World. And it is a book that is about 200 pages, 7 chapters. We won't cover all 7, but I think we'll get 5 of the 7.
That's right.
And I thought we'd talk about hopeless, then Jesus arrived. That's the 5th chapter there, and I think you're the one to maybe explain that story for
Well,
us.
it's an amazing story, and JoAnn was privileged to go to an underground church meeting with women, and all of a sudden, a church, the lights went out, the doors bolted, curtains were shut, and women came in, and they took off their hijabs, and they sat and told their stories, and JoAnn was blown away. She was really undone just to hear the commitment level of these women. Jamila shared her story, and Jamila was from northeastern Syria, and she was in Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor is on the Euphrates River. It's a place where the Ottoman Turks killed over 100 Christians at once and hung women on the cross, and then hundreds more. So it has a spiritual history there, and it's not good. Her family was radical. They were pro-ISIS and fighting against the government. And in the midst of it, there's just death and bombing, and the government of Syria is attacking and ISIS fighting back. It's just horrible. If you can imagine raising kids there, and they can't leave. Well, one day, Jamila's walking down the street with a couple of her friends, and one of them says, and of course, they're all covered Muslim women. This one woman says to her, "Have you heard that Jesus is coming to people in dreams?" Well, Jamila never said this out loud. She never said this word at all. She just thought it. Wow, Jesus is a man of peace. I wish he'd come to me in a dream. And that was it. One time, one thought, never left her lips. Well, months later, she had a stroke because she was not able to get her high blood pressure medicine. Her blood pressure medicine, she's extremely high, had a stroke, is in a coma. Family thinks she's going to die. She's in a hospital. And she wakes up, but she can't move, and she can't open her eyes, and she hears the doctor telling the family she's too far gone. Jamila will be here a couple of days at best, and then she's going to die. There's just, it's irreversible. It cannot happen that she's going to make recovery. So you should be planning her funeral. I'm sorry to tell you that. And so right in the middle of that, she can hear, but that's the only sense she has. She can't see, can't move. She said, Kerby, she felt like she was trapped underwater trying to get out and just couldn't move. And all of a sudden, at that point, Jesus stood at the foot of her bed. There was Jesus in a white robe. And he said, Jamila, I'm Jesus.
Yes.
I hear you've been looking for me. I just love that. Do you remember in the New Testament when Jesus would read their minds, the Pharisees? And I think they must have thought, did I say that out loud? How did he know that? She thought the thought once, and there is Jesus. And he says, I love you. I'm here for you.
Yes.
And you're going to recover because I'm going to heal you for my glory. And he touched her. And she said, as she told the story to JoAnn, I didn't know what praising Jesus meant. I had no idea. But here's the doctor talking. All I can do is hear. He's saying I'm going to die. And after Jesus leaves, I had this feeling of I want to raise my hand to worship him. And her hand went up in the air. And the next thing she heard was a thud on the floor. And it was her mother fainting. And so it ends up that Jesus would come to her each day and heal a part of her.
Yes.
And finally, there was a full recovery. And each day, her family was there and they were seeing this happen. Well, as she comes out of the coma, the family starts jumping around yelling, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. And she comes out and you know what her first words are?
Jesus.
Praise Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And the family looks at her. They can't believe it. But you know what? That healing, Kerby, was not just for her. It was for her family, a radical family living in a historically anti-Christian town, pro-ISIS, hated Christians, heard about Jesus. One by one, this radical family came to faith in Christ. And of course, Jamila's the first one to say, it doesn't always happen like this. I mean, we just don't have all these great happy endings in the Middle East, but slowly they could not deny the power of God. They were at her side. They saw it day after day after day till she was fully healed. And when she told her story, JoAnn just said, I could hardly write it through the tears, just thinking about amazing how Jesus was. But I love the power of Jesus to do that. But the tenderness when he says to her, I hear you've been looking for me. I mean, that is so our Jesus, you know?
I love the line here. It says, the first words I heard my father say were, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. But my first words were, Jesus, Jesus, don't leave me. I love you. That certainly quieted the room. My shocked family could not comprehend the words that hung in the air. Again, we're giving you the, if you will, the very short version of these wonderful stories that when you read them, you just go, if I hadn't heard you actually write those down and you hadn't heard them and written them down, people would say, you've got to be making these
I know,
up. That's
right?
But that's why you wrote these. Isn't that right?
Exactly. You know, God is the best storyteller. Storyteller, he really is. And we thought the same thing as I'm going around the circle hearing all these women's stories, each one different and unique, but preciously beautiful. And yet when you look at these women, they look like you and I, like regular, ordinary people. But we all have a story, as you just said, Tom, and God is the transformer. Jesus is the transformer. And man, he tells the best stories, and he does it in the most intimate way.
Oh, man. And if you meet Nori or Farah or Jamila, they have one thing in common, Kerby, that each of them are like a stick of dynamite for Jesus. They are just powerful. They are not afraid of anyone. They have all given up their lives as far as they'll say openly, well, we know we're going to die for Jesus, but that's what he said in the New Testament. Take up your cross and follow me. So one of our leaders in the Middle East said, listen, we're all going to die one day or another, so we might as well die for Jesus.
Yes. And you think about the martyr's oath and some of the other things that are out there as well. But I'm just about out of time. And Tom, I want to encourage people to go back to your website, Uncharted Ministries, because if they sit there and say, these are incredible stories, and I'd like to hear some more, and I'd like to know how I can support the ministry that you have and how I can be an encouragement to these believers in the Muslim world, how can they do so?
Oh, boy, they can do it. They can pray. We have a prayer initiative 838 on Facebook for Romans 8:38 and 39. Every day we're praying for persecuted believers. Some of them are leaders, others that we pick up in the news. And so we pray every day at 8:38 p.m. for them. And then also you can even support some of these people. Dina and Mohammed have been thoroughly discipled, grown up in the Lord. They work with us now. And boy, your life will be changed hearing their stories as you see them going into the refugee camps, risking, this is day after day after day, going into radicalized areas to share the gospel. And in fact, Mohammed told us recently that he kept texting Dina in this one camp, and he kept doing the two words, get out, because they were coming. The terrorists were coming. She finished her prayer, led some women to Christ, just filtered out throughout the tents, got away. These are women that are willing to risk, and you can support them. In some cases, we'll take you to the Middle East on some of our Bible tours and mission trips, and you'll get to meet them.
Well, again, I know people would love to get a tour with you, and let's see if we can get everybody out of these lockdowns and the pandemic and get back to all the things we used to do. So thank you both for coming in here. Of course, I've known you both. Matter of fact, one time when we were in Florida, I heard that you were speaking in a church, and my wife and I drove across Florida so we get a chance to see you both, including you dressing up as a Muslim woman for a while. So I have seen you do some very exciting things, so it has been a delight to have you here. One last time, the book is entitled Women Who Risk, Secret Agents for Jesus in the Muslim World. It is written by Tom and JoAnn Doyle. They've been in studio with us, and it's just been great to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kerby. This has truly been a joy.
It's a privilege.
We do have a link to unchartedministries.com, so take the time to visit some of that material there as well. I think you will benefit from it tremendously, and it is all part of our website at pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer and Steve for his help as a producer. And if you would like to listen to this again, go to the website, pointofview.net, and you can download it or watch it on the YouTube channel. Pass it on to some others, and we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.